The Halfmen of O, Chapter 1, The Message. Our story begins on Lodestone Creek one summer holiday. At least, Nick's part, and it starts there. Susan had been involved for the whole of her life, though she did not know it, and Jimmy Jaspers, with his nose for an easy dollar, had been working for the Halfies since he came to the creek in spring. They found him when he started fossicking round the gorge, but he had only glimpsed their world, and though he thought he had the Halfies sized up, and knew they were tough as old boots, he didn't have a glimmer of their real nature. He thought he would be more than a match for them. As Brand was to say, Jimmy did not really understand evil. But to get back to Lodestone Creek. It ran down out of the bush, through the Ferris farm, and joined the river at Devil's Elbow. Some early miner had given the place that name. He must have been down on his luck. There was nothing sinister about the bend, and the farm enclosed in it was a lively place, mooing cows, gobbling turkeys, that sort of thing. It lay south of Collingwood in Golden Bay, in one of the lonelier corners of New Zealand. Susan Ferris had lived there all her life. Nicholas Quinn, her cousin, came with his parents for a couple of weeks each January. He lived in Auckland, far away. Nick and Susan pretended that they got on pretty well. It kept the grown-ups happy. In fact, Susan found Nick's boastfulness hard to take. He seemed to think that people who lived in cities were the only ones who knew anything. 5 minutes with him was enough. Then she had to get off on her own. So he accused her of being stuck up. He thought she was weird as well. He was not alone in that. His mother, Susan's aunt, declared her strange, and his father had been heard to say that she needed a swift kick in the rear end to wake her up. Nick agreed with that. This year, the year of our story, she seemed worse. Nick and his mother and father had driven down the length of the North Island. They had crossed the strait on the ferry, rolling in 10-foot waves, and driven through the Rye Valley and Nelson, and over the Tākaka Hill and through Golden Bay. They reached the farm on the bend of the river, and it seemed to Nick that they had been weeks on the road. But when he found Susan by the waterfall on Lodestone Creek, all she could say was, "Oh, it's you." She went on staring into the water. He was mortified. She didn't have to pretend to like him, but she might say hello. A year ago he would have pushed her in. Today he just got in his togs and dived in the pool, straight into whatever it was she was staring at in there. He felt he was making a sharp comeback. But when he came up from his dive, she was walking down to the river, strolling away, careless, quite remote, and he realized he hadn't hurt her at all. She hadn't even noticed. "You keep out of my way and I'll keep out of yours," he yelled. She made no sign of having heard, but kept on walking neatly over the boulders, her blue towel trailing from her hand, and soon she went out of sight towards the elbow. That got rid of her, Nick said, but he was disappointed. He had hoped they might be better friends this year. It was time they stopped carrying on like a couple of kids. Soon he forgot her. He stood under the waterfall and felt it beat on him like hammers. It seemed to be trying to nail him into the rocks. When he'd had enough of that, he climbed to the top of the fall, taking care, making sure of each grip. It was a long way down. But heights didn't scare him. Rock climbing was a sport he meant to take up when he was older. He sunbathed on a warm stone ledge at the top, with water running by so clear that it magnified the pebbles. The stream flowing into the Orere River was his favourite place in all the world. He saw it for only a couple of weeks each summer, but it was more real to him than the quarter-acre section he lived on in Mount Eden. Sometimes he lay in bed at night and travelled up it in his mind, from the waterfall to the place where the gorge closed in like a pair of grey stone hands making a steeple. This year he meant to try panning for gold. The creek had been worked over pretty thoroughly in the old days, but it was worth a try. Prospectors came there still. It wasn't called Lodestone Creek for nothing. Nick was one of those people who could not keep still. He spent 5 minutes lying in the sun, and then he was up to have a look at the gorge. One day he meant to go through and see what was on the other side. Susan's father had said to stay out of it. There were deep holes and falls of rock and, he said, giant eels that would take your foot off with a single bite. But he grinned when he said it, and Nick knew he was only having him on. Susan had said there was an old gold mine on the other side. She had been into the shaft a little way, but the timber holding up the roof was rotten, and it was dangerous to go far. She seemed to be warning him, but he took it as a challenge. If she could go in, it would be easy for him. One day soon, he was going to try. He ran along rocky shelves sloping to the water. It was a game with him to travel up the creek without getting his feet wet. It meant making long jumps and stepping on boulders that tipped under you, and crawling along stone walls like a fly. He made it easily that day, probably because he was a year older. Soon the noise of the waterfall faded. He stopped. Far away cattle were mooing. It was getting on for milking time. A dog barked. Insects sang. But there was another sound. It was like a motor, like a chainsaw or mower, very distant. Then he noticed that instead of being clear as glass, the water had taken on a brown cloudiness. Someone or something up ahead was stirring it up. He went on curiously. The noise became louder, and soon there was no mistaking it, the noise of a two-stroke engine. It came racketing down Lodestone Creek, bouncing off the rock walls, slamming here and there, until Nick thought the top would come off his head. Already he had guessed what it was, some sort of homemade suction dredge. He came round the corner and saw it, the motor from a Morrison mower floating on a raft no bigger than the top of a school desk. It made such a hideous noise in the stream bed that everything, the trees, the boulders, seemed to vibrate and be on the point of falling apart. Nick yelled out but could not hear his voice. This wasn't gold prospecting, he thought. This was like being in the middle of Queen Street. An old man was wading in the stream, bent almost double, sweeping the bottom with a gadget like a vacuum cleaner. He was wearing boots and thick trousers, held up by a knotted piece of twine. He had no shirt, but a woolen singlet that might once have been pink. Nick came up on him, jumping along the boulders. "G'day," he yelled. The old man did not hear. Nick came round and looked at him side on. He was an ugly old man, a big rough nose coloured with veins, a drooping lower lip all wet with spit and yellow with tobacco, and loose skin under his chin like a turkey's wattles. Nick didn't mind. He seemed like a real prospector, one of those old blokes with a pack and shovel who'd worked the rivers in the old days. "You finding any gold?" he yelled. The old man saw him. He swung round, eyes of a reddish colour, and pinned Nick on them. Then he ploughed back to his motor and switched it off. A sudden, dreadful absence of noise came on Lodestone Creek. It seemed to make Nick dizzy. He couldn't move. The old man came at him, churning up water with his boots. "You been spying on me?" He put out a hand, large as a dinner plate, tough and brown as boot leather, and held Nick by his jaw.